Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. Have you ever considered that the story of Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry as it's called, is really kind of a crazy story? Have you been puzzled by the dissonance of that? Here we are a week before Easter, and the crazy Holy Week that follows it, and how people seem to be so happy during it, during the worst week of Jesus' life. How could they be this way? What did Jesus think of it? The other thing about this is the word Hosanna itself. We take the word Hosanna as praise, but really in Hebrew, it's quite a bit different. Why were people throwing their cloaks down? Why were they waving branches? Why did they act the way they did? And what was Jesus thinking as he approached Jerusalem? How did we know that, did he know what was going to happen to him? Did he know that once he crossed into Jerusalem that things would be very different coming up? And then we would go into the final third of each of the Gospels after this story, the whole idea of the Passion story. And it's often called Passion Sunday for this reason. So I'd like to talk about what was the theology behind this? What was Jesus, or the thinking? What were the politics of what he was doing? Then what people wanted to do with him. And then I really want to talk about the Jesus I love. The reason why this story is so important to me is that it really shows the Jesus that I love. In Luke especially, this is after the triumphal entry, and Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. Then he goes to the temple to cleanse the temple, which in other Gospels is flipping the tables and causing a big ruckus. And how can these all be related? So let's get into this. We'll start by looking at Luke 19:28 through 39. And this is the triumphal entry. And then I'll talk a bit about what that looked like to Jesus and how this really impacted the way that he approached Jerusalem. You have to remember this was happening at the beginning of Passover week, when the population in and around Jerusalem probably went up tenfold. People were camping in the hills everywhere because there wasn't enough room within the city. So there was a big ruckus going on at this time. So I'll read a few verses here just to give you an idea of what was happening. Starting with verse 28. After he said this, he went on ahead and going up to Jerusalem. So he was leaving Bethany and Bethphage over to the east of Jerusalem, and he was going up to Jerusalem. When he came near Bethphage and Bethany at the place called the Mount of Olives, he sent two of the disciples, saying, "Go into the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you'll find there a colt that had never been ridden. Untie it and bring it here. And if anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' just say, 'The Lord needs it.'" And so those who were sent departed and found what he had told them, and they were untying the colt. And the owners asked, "Why are you untying the colt?" They said, "The Lord needs it." And then they brought it. And after throwing their cloaks on the colt, that's interesting, they set Jesus on it. And as he rode along, people were spreading their cloaks on the road. Now, as he was approaching the path down from the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of disciples began to praise God joyfully with loud voices for all the deeds of power that they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Praise to heaven and glory in the highest heaven." And some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, order your disciples to stop." And he answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out. So we have a really clear image here of Jesus getting on a colt and riding to Jerusalem. And the way to picture this is if you look at any maps, or if you've been to the Garden of Gethsemane, which is right on the other side of the Kidron Valley from the wall, the east wall of Jerusalem. Jerusalem's kind of way up there. And from that, and as he was riding along, had to look up to see it. And there's a little bit of a winding path that went up to the Golden Gate. Well, that was today it's all bricked off, all filled in with stone. But in Jesus' day, that Eastern Gate was one of the ways that you got into Jerusalem, and that led directly to the temple. So that's what he saw as he was riding along. There's lots of theology associated with this idea of being on a clean colt, a colt that had never been ridden. What did it mean by him going on that instead of saying walking to Jerusalem, or riding on a horse? Or something more majestic like this. There's a lot to that. And then the people's responses to it. The thing that I think that is most important here is the reaction of the people. So as Jesus is riding toward the wall, which is way up there, and he knows as soon as he goes through that wall, he's going to lose sort of control over things. That's going to begin the action. The people are along the road, and this is probably just a small path, who knows? I have a picture that I'm going to put on a bulletin cover in the Garden of Gethsemane, and it shows the road being maybe 10 feet wide, just a path, a trail. Who knows what it really was, because there may have been a little wider to take carts and so forth, but it was a pretty humble road. It was definitely not something big and triumphal, but there were people lining it, and they were hooping and hollering. In the other Gospels, it says that they were yelling Hosanna. And we think Hosanna as meaning something of praise. Hey, Hosanna, Hosanna, Jesus. Well, Hosanna means save us now in Hebrew. Save us. So it's a plea, it's a cry. Jesus, save us. Now here in Luke's gospel, we get a little bit of this because they said they praised God joyfully with a loud voice for all of the deeds of power that they had seen. So they had heard stories about Jesus, and they were expressing their desire for Jesus' power. And that's central here because, again, when you have maybe several times the normal group of people that are around Jerusalem, because it's Passover week, they had heard about Jesus. So Jesus was popular. They knew who he was, and they go, we see that Jesus has done powerful things. So I would say there's probably two main reasons why they gathered around Jesus. One is political and one is personal. The political one is quite clear, and that is that the Jewish people were always restive in this time, and probably all of the people who had any way of being poor, they were either poor or they were not part of the elite, were very restive. The Romans knew this intently, right? They were always trying to keep peace. And, it was only a couple of generations later that they actually completely destroyed the temple and Jerusalem because things did get out of control. So there was always the threat of insurrection going on. The other people who knew this all the time were the chief priests in there, because they were complicit with the Romans. They were always trying to work with the Romans to keep the people under control. So clearly, these people saw, hey, here's Jesus. He's very popular. He's very powerful. He's done a lot of powerful things. Maybe he can do powerful things for us, right? Maybe he can maybe he can finally bring about the kingdom of heaven, bring about the kingdom of God for us. And this is a consistent theme through the Gospels. You even see this in Jesus' own group of 12 disciples around him. Even after resurrection, they say, okay, now is the time. Now is the time for Israel to gain its power back, away from the Romans. So this is always there. The other part is maybe more personal, and that is that Jesus had developed a reputation for being a healer. It may have if people knew what we read in John. In the Gospel of John, only a couple days before this, had risen Lazarus from the dead, and his friend over in Bethany. Bethany is only 3 miles from the temple in Jerusalem to the east. So it says that he was very reluctant to go to Bethany too quickly, especially too long before the Passover. And that's probably, that tells us a lot. That probably means that there were spies around, there were people looking for Jesus. He didn't want to come toward Jerusalem when too long before Passover, because during Passover, like I said, there were many, many thousands of additional people. One of the stories that we keep reading about is how the disciples would retreat to the Garden of Gethsemane every night during Passion Week, and that was probably very strategic as well, because we get this image that the Garden of Gethsemane was like deserted or quiet. No, but nothing of the kind. There were probably hundreds, maybe thousands of people camped all around Jerusalem, because it's Passover week, right? So Jesus could blend into the crowd, and his disciples could blend into the crowd every evening. If they stayed in the city, they had a much greater chance of getting caught, much greater chance of being kidnapped. And so there's a lot of this here, is that the whole story about being in Bethany, where his friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were, that we read about in John, had a lot to do with, waiting for the right time, and a lot of this going on. So Jesus' reputation was ahead of him, not only for insurrection, but also for healing. They probably knew about Lazarus. They had heard about all of the healings that Jesus had done around. So a lot of these people are just saying, hey, come on, we've seen all of the things that you've done. Do them for us. Very interesting. As far as going in on a cult, there's a lot of theology around this. I don't really quite understand all of it, honestly. The way I interpret it is that if Jesus had walked in there, that would be like marching into Jerusalem. I think that would have been seen as being very threatening. You could see if Jesus was at the head of a column of people behind him. I think the authorities would have looked at that and would have clamped down right away. There were always soldiers around, right? By going on a cult, or sometimes it's called or a donkey or whatever, a very humble way to travel to Jerusalem, probably would have been seen quite differently. I mean, who's going to follow this humble display of going up to the wall? That's not really seen as threatening. Of course, if Jesus were on a horse, which is probably less likely anyway, because, horses were for Romans primarily. But, in any kind of display of power, that would have also been seen as very threatening, and probably would have meant he being arrested right on the spot, right? thrown into prison, maybe executed right away. So a lot of this had to do with sort of just practical things, right? Very practical for him to wait for the crowds to come and not show any kind of great sense of threat to the authorities. And you can see this throughout the Gospels, is that Jesus avoids direct confrontation a number of times, particularly when scribes and Pharisees are trying to entrap him, what they call in the book of John the Jews, which really meant the Jewish leadership. Were always trying to find a way to get Jesus trapped so they could arrest him. So if you can look at it that way. But I look at also what you see here too, is that after Jesus does go up to the wall and he goes through the wall, and maybe as he's going to the wall, you can see he's crying. He weeps over Jerusalem. In another gospel it says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and all of that. He's lamenting about this. And, he says, indeed, the days will come when your enemies will set up ramparts around you and surround you and hem you in from every side. They will crush you to the ground and your children with you, and they will not leave with you one stone upon another. And people see this as a sort of prophecy from Jesus, but really what Jesus is saying is that, this is coming. This idea of a new way, a new freedom is coming. So don't rest on the old power structures. He's speaking against the complicity of the chief priests who give in to the Romans all the time to preserve their power. The very next thing that happens too is Jesus cleansing the temple. In Luke, it's a little bit different. It's a little less aggressive in Luke, but still had that idea that he goes to the temple and my house shall not be a place of prayer, and you've made it a den of robbers. Every day he was teaching in the temple, and the chief priests and the scribes and the leaders of the people kept looking for a way to kill him. But they did not find anything they could do, for all the people were spellbound by what they heard. Again, so Jesus is protected by the crowd in one respect, and Jesus is trying to avoid building the crowd up into something that will make things happen too quickly. But Jesus knows once he gets through that wall, once he climbs, on the back of the colt, climbs the zigzags that go up to the Golden Gate in the east wall of Jerusalem, that he's going to lose control of his fate. Yes, he's surrounded by disciples, but he's trying to get through to people. And the cleansing of the temple is a great thing, as a direct affront to that. So think about this for a second. This is where I love this story so much. With so much uncertainty, and you can tell that Jesus must have been very careful and afraid to whip things up too much because of all these other actions I'm talking about. He still goes forward with it. He knows this is not going to end well. He knows that once he's out of the domain, once he's out of the hills, once he's inside the walls of Jerusalem, he's going to lose control over things, and that the chief priests are going to be complicit with Pilate. And it also says in the Gospels that Herod is in town, probably for the Passover. Well, when you have Herod, which is over the Galileans, so that, Pilate's not going to go ahead and kill Jesus without permission from Herod, because Jesus is a Galilean, and the chief priests, Pilate can't just go and kill Jesus, who's leading, a bunch of rabble-rousing potential insurrectionists, right? So they have to collude. Herod, Pilate, and the chief priests all have to collude in order to um, arrest Jesus and kill him. So I look at this thing right here as the chief priests, the scribes, and leaders of the people, which is really all the power structures, are kept looking for a way to kill him. To me, that means that they were trying to figure out how to get, the Romans on board, how to thwart the power of the regular people. Because they were all very sensitive to the fact that these regular people were, they could only control them so much, right? So again, to me, this means that you see Jesus in a bunch of different ways in this. You can see him as strategic and careful. You can see him as audacious and maybe crazy, because he's putting himself at the center of attention here in a way that's going to get him killed. And he puts himself in the hands of authorities, but you notice he doesn't do it recklessly. He does it strategically and carefully, and he times it with Passover. Now, again, a lot of people have looked at this very theologically, that Jesus is, in this way, fulfilling the scriptures and so forth. Yeah, sure, you can do that, but I think that takes away a little bit of this idea of that Jesus is trying to get to people and maximize his impact and message before he's going to be taken away. He's making a big bet here. And I think that these political dynamics, when you really understand them and how they're being used, and the context and the physical space, this idea of being outside the city, riding into the city, doing these things, and then retreating from the city every day for during the Passover season, really says a lot about what they were doing and how Jesus was working during this time. That the fact that they had the Last Supper inside the city. There's actually a place in the city today that traditionally where the upper room is, how one of his own, Judas, was colluding with the priests. We don't know necessarily whether the priests were going along or unhappy about Jesus, for example, cleansing the temple. We don't know if Judas thought that his actions were going to, his betrayal of Jesus was going to lead to Jesus' death. Maybe Judas thought, oh, well, I'm just trying to get, maybe he thought he was going to be negotiating things. Maybe he thought that if Jesus were under the protection of the priests rather than under the Romans, maybe that would be different. These are all different scenarios that you can think of. But the fact is that what was happening here, the people were saying, Hosanna, Hosanna, save us, Jesus, save us, Jesus. And that in this crazy mix of different motives and everything, that once Jesus was inside, he knew that his fate was sealed. And that it took incredible insight, incredible bravery for Jesus to do this. Again, this also talks a lot about, what parts did Jesus know? Is it because he was divine, or, just a really insightful person? I think that when we believe in the incarnation, we believe that Jesus is truly fully human in our theologies, then we have to say that that Jesus didn't have all knowledge or complete control or complete as a human being. Because if you do have complete control, complete knowledge and everything, then you're not fully human. So the incarnation doesn't make sense in this case. So we have to give credit to Jesus for being strategic, smart, and astonishingly brave in this moment. And that's the Jesus I really admire and look up to. And I see that constantly in the gospel stories. And then you see that replayed again in the people that after Jesus, especially Peter, of course, and Paul, but also the many other disciples and apostles and the many women that supported Jesus. People like in the next week, we hear a lot about Mary Magdalene and going to the tomb, and the pivotal role that Mary Magdalene and Mary, Mother of Jesus, who shows up in the book of Acts briefly. You can just see all of these people being inspired by the bravery and being inspired by the teachings of Jesus, and then carrying the message beyond that. It is an inspiring story, and I think that we can see that with this. So that's my hope for you is that as we approach the Holy Week, that some of the dissonance, some of the weirdness about this is very, it is part of the story. One of the things that I always say on Easter, and I will again this time, is that the Holy Week, the week of Passover, is crazy. It's noisy. It's loud. It's threatening. It's so much tension in the story going on. There's betrayal. There's denial. There's the hosannas and lifting up of Jesus turns to spitting and slapping and a crown of thorns. It's just so discordant and upsetting. And then we have the quietness of Sabbath. That's something that between Good Friday and between Easter Sunday is Sabbath. And in the church has always been called the Great Vigil time. And that's peaceful, quiet. And then on the morning of Easter, after the Sabbath, when the women go to the tomb, it's very peaceful. Jesus is gone. The grave clothes are left behind. And then we see that in Jesus' appearances afterwards. There's not great trumpets and triumphs and all of these things. It's very mellow and peaceful and quiet. So that contrast between all of the anger and acrimony and loudness of the Passover week and the Passion week, when Jesus, up to the point of Jesus being crucified, and then the odd peacefulness that happens afterwards, is a real juxtaposition. So it's something I really hope for, is that when you go through this coming week, and then you encounter the risen Christ on Easter, that you can take comfort in that all this craziness, messiness, anger, sinfulness, spitting and slapping and crucifixion that we experience in today's world can lead to resurrection and peacefulness and the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. So with that, I say, people say lots of things about the Bible that aren't really there, but one of the great things about the Bible is this incredible passion story that we relive every year, that we relive daily in the daily resurrection that we experience. And with that, I say, God bless you.